The Buddha vehemently denies the general notion of self that many people hold to be true in Western societies. The Buddha's argument for no self is based on the conception of the five aggregates and seems to be valid. However, if one is not entirely convinced by the Buddha's argument for the lack of self, he is not limited to his arguments alone. Other philosophers have come to similar conclusions as the Buddha on the concept of a self. Notably, Parfit, an active professor at New York University and Oxford, argues to the same ends as the Buddha. In his book Reasons and Persons, Parfit analyzes a variety of subjects such as: what do the facts of life involve? What makes me the same person throughout my life and a different person from you? What are important about these facts? The answers to the questions Parfit raises cover numerous philosophical fields, including theories about morality and rationality. Relative to Buddhism and the notion of a self, the answers also involve a theory of personal identity to which a section of the book is devoted. The Buddha's argument for no self stems from what he sees as being the implication of the five aggregates. The five aggregates are a dynamic cycle of four principles which are collectively termed consciousness. The first aggregate is the aggregate of matter, which includes the four great elements and the derivatives of the four great elements. The second aggregate is the aggregate of sensations, which includes all the sensations we experience through the relationships between our central organs and the external world. The third aggregate is the aggregate of perceptions, which is exactly similar in organization to the aggregate of sensations insofar that there are corresponding perceptions for each of the six internal faculties or senses. The fourth aggregate is the aggregate of mental formations, which is composed of all activities, including karma. The fifth and final aggregate is the aggregate of consciousness. Consciousness is considered to be one's response to a stimulus, which is perceived through the aggregate of perceptions and the aggregate of sensation. By understanding the five aggregates, it is possible to understand the Buddha's comment towards the disciple, quote, "You stupid one who believes in self," unquote. The Buddha sees consciousness not as something that needs to be attributed to an object or self, but as something that arises out of conditions. As far as the Buddha is concerned, consciousness is named according to whatever condition through which it arises. On account of the eye and visible forms arises a consciousness, and it is called visual consciousness. The same could be said for other sensory experiences as well. For example, we could have an olfactory consciousness while passing by a restaurant. The Buddha also supplies a metaphor for the construction of a consciousness. Quote, "A fire that burns on account of wood burns only when there is a supply, but dies down in that very place when the supply is no longer there, because then the condition has changed, but the fire does not cross over the splinters, etc., and become a splinter fire. In essence, as conditions change, so does consciousness, and eventually conditions have changed enough so that nothing remains the same. A soul or self would have to be constant through existence. The Buddha does not see anything to attribute a permanent self, and thus compares the human life or psyche to a stream when he says that the world is in continuous flux and is impermanent. Parfit takes a different path to the doctrine of no self. He begins by dividing the notion of personal identity into a physical criterion and a psychological criterion. The standard view of the physical criterion for personal identity is that an object's identity over time must have a continuous path through space. For example, in order for a basketball that has just passed through the net to be the same basketball that I was dribbling, the same ball must have followed a line from my hand to the basketball net. We are also given a view that allows for physical identity over time, such as with the human body. The view is as follows. 1. What is necessary is not the continued existence of the whole body, but the continued existence of enough of the brain to be the brain of a living person. X today is one and the same person as Y at some past time if and only if, number 2, enough of Y's brain continued to exist and is now X's brain, and 3, this physical continuity has not taken a branching form. For personal identity over time consists of holding facts like 2 and 3. It may now seem that there is a reasonable reply to the Buddha's no-self argument. However, it should be questioned if physical identity is all that we really care about, and if it is sufficient for our common view of personal identity. For example, most people who hold a common view of personal identity could imagine that they could wake up in another body. For these people, physical identity would not be sufficient for personal identity. Thus, Parfit examines the psychological criterion of personal identity. The psychological criterion is similar to the physical criterion in that it involves psychological continuity of sorts. The psychological continuity usually involves memory, because without memory we would not be aware of our own existence. Parfit considers two relationships involving continuity of memory. The first relationship is called psychological connectedness, and would be called samtana or santana by Buddhists. Psychological connectedness is the holding of particular direct psychological connections. Parfit cites problems with this view, mainly because a direct psychological connection means that we have to remember an experience. Because people often forget things from their formative years, the view of psychological connectedness would not allow for many people to have personal identity, and thus seems odd. A different relationship is called psychological continuity, which is the holding of overlapping chains of strong psychological connectedness. The psychological criterion is: there is psychological continuity if and only if there are overlapping chains of strong connectedness. X today is one and the same person as Y at some past time, if and only if X is psychologically continuous with Y. This continuity has the right kind of cause, and it has not taken a branching form. Personal identity over time just consists in holding of facts like 2 to 4. Psychological continuity allows for there to be identity over time in much the same way that the physical criterion allows for identity and accounts for the same problems of change. It may seem that we have an answer to the problem of life being like a river. However, after seeing Parfit's arguments against the soul, it becomes apparent that he and the Buddha hold very similar views. Parfit's first claim against the notion of a soul comes when he says that the subject of an experience is not a separately existing entity from the brain and body that experiences mental or physical events. The reason for holding this view is that even if there were souls, we could not know if they continued to exist from one moment to the next. Parfit asks us to consider: if the memories and disposition of one soul were identical to another soul's memories and disposition, how could we determine if two identical souls transferred bodies overnight? If a soul is something else other than our memories and disposition, how could we tell if we received a new soul every night while we were sleeping? Parfit makes sure to point out that it is not that we do not know whether there are souls or not, and that therefore they do not exist. It is that we do not have reason to believe souls exist, and we should therefore not believe in them. However, it is possible that they do exist. Parfit tells us what he feels we would need to know to have evidence for the existence of the soul in his Japanese woman example. In it, a Japanese woman might claim to remember living a life as a Celtic hunter and a warrior in the Bronze Age. On the basis of her apparent memories, she might make many predictions which could be checked by archaeologists. Thus, she might claim to remember having a bronze bracelet shaped like two fighting dragons, and she might claim that she remembers bearing this bracelet beside some particular megalith just before the battle in which she was killed. Archaeologists might now just find such a bracelet buried in this spot, and their instruments might show that the earth had not been here disturbed for at least 2,000 years. Additionally, it would also have to be shown that there was no physical continuity between the woman and the Celtic warrior. For example, a proton from the brain that could possibly be the carrier of memory. If it was shown that the brain was absolutely not the carrier of memory as is normally believed to be the case, we would have to consider the possibility of a soul or a non-reductionist view. However, the kind of evidence that is present in the Japanese woman example is not present for us. Even the most outrageous stories of people recalling past lives do not have the level of detail that Parfit asked for. If we find Parfit convincing, we are left with his view of psychological continuity, in which he explores further in a section titled, Why We Are Not What We Believe Ourselves to Be. An abbreviated case to one Parfit considers in this section is as follows. One's brain is hooked up to a machine that can change your brain's properties. There are a bunch of switches on the machine, and if one is flipped, you lose a memory, which is in turn replaced with the memory of Napoleon's. If two switches are flipped, you lose two memories, which are in turn replaced by two memories of Napoleon's. If all the switches are flipped, you lose all of your memories and have a complete set of Napoleonic delusions. A similar situation can be run for a character or one's physical body, i.e. a finger is swapped. We can also consider a machine that is the combination of the character memory and physical embodiment machines, and thus consider a spectrum in which we change not at all to changing every aspect of ourselves. The question that Parfit drives at in considering the combined spectrum of character, memory, and physical change is in which cases do we survive? On the near end, which would be the equivalent of bumping one's head, very little or no change takes place. It seems obvious that we survive. On the far end of the spectrum, it seems clear that we are no longer the same person. However, the cases in the middle are much less clear for various reasons, and the question to whether or not one survives does not seem to have a definite answer. Yet it seems that there must be an answer to the question of whether or not one exists. If we agree that existence necessitates an answer, there must be a line somewhere. However, the case of existence would then resemble a Sorites problem, or the argument given to the Bactrian king Menander. In these types of problems, we are led by small steps to absurd conclusions. In the argument to Menander, we replace parts of a chariot one by one. After replacing each part, we ask ourselves whether the chariot is the same chariot or not. Since the difference of one part never seems to be a substantial change, the answer always seems to be yes. However, eventually the entire chariot has changed. If we want to draw a line at 50% of the planks, the difference of the ship existing or not will be dependent on the trivial difference of one plank. Applied to Parfit's combined spectrum, we would then have to draw an arbitrary line in which a single memory, character, or quirk, or strand of hair would be the difference between one's existing or not existing. Neither Nagasena nor Parfit want to make this arbitrary line. However, they come to different conclusions. Nagasena wants to take a stand and say that the identity of everything must be determinate, that there must be an answer to the question of whether or not something exists. Since everything's existence is unable to be verified in the ultimate sense of truth, nothing truly exists. Parfit instead gives examples of things that he feels have indeterminate identities. In one instance, we can imagine a club that disbands. The exact same members later form a club with the exact same rules. Is it the same club? What if one member did not join again, or if there is a slight modification of the rules? Unless we redefine clubs so that there's a strict criterion, we cannot be sure. Parfit considers questions like these to be similar to questions of personal identity in that they are both empty. That is, that it is possible to know everything about the situation without knowing whether or not the country or person or club still exists. To better understand how this applies to personal identity, Parfit considers questions of what would happen in situations involving brain manipulation. One of these situations is what would happen in a teletransporter where an exact replica of you with respect to your psychology and body is created on a faraway moon. Your body on Earth is destroyed. If we believe in non-reductionism, there would be no reason to say the person on the faraway moon is not you. The person remembers stepping onto the teletransporter, has the same exact likes and dislikes, and the same scars, etc. We can also imagine a case where your body is not destroyed, and Parfit still says that the person on the faraway moon is you, for the exact same reasons that the person is you in the first situation in which you are destroyed. The person is not numerically identical to you, but this does not seem like an important concern to Parfit, because he believes identity is an intrinsic concern, meaning that your identity should not be influenced by outside considerations. For example, I exist whether or not you exist, or whether or not somebody just like me exists. Parfit concludes that personal identity is not what matters, but all is not lost. We can still identify a relationship between some people and others, and this relationship is based on a causal relationship between mind states, or psychological continuity. So, when we are about to die, we should actually be saying, quote, "There will be no future experiences that will be related, in certain ways, to these present experiences," unquote. In this way, Parfit feels that the Buddha and he would have agreed with his position, because both of them feel that a person is simply a conscious flowing stream of events. Reading Parfit's final remarks after he concludes that his view allows for liberation from the self, one sees strong correlations to what the Buddha said in terms of the difficulty of dissolving the self, the truth of anatman or no self despite our strong inclinations to believe otherwise, the joy of liberation, a concern for others, and as mentioned before, a lack of fear surrounding death. Quote, "The truth is very different from what we are inclined to believe. Even if we are not aware of this, most of us are non-reductionists. If we consider many of my imagined cases, we would be strongly inclined to believe that our continued existence is a deep further fact, distinct from physical and psychological continuity, and a fact that must be all or nothing. This is not true. Is the truth depressing? I find it liberating and consoling. When I believe that my existence was such a further fact, I seemed imprisoned in myself. I now live in the open air. There is still a difference between my life and the lives of other people, but the difference is less. Other people are closer. I am less concerned about the rest of my own life and more concerned about the lives of others." In conclusion, Derek Parfit uses slightly different arguments to argue to the same ends as the Buddha regarding personal identity. The arguments are very strong, and the conclusions have certainly spanned for a great deal of time, especially if they existed before the Buddha's enlightenment. While the arguments may be critiqued, it is doubtful that the conclusions will be, and, if they are, it seems likely that they will be revised to become even stronger.